The clipboard was the first thing I saw, a slab of dark wood held like a shield against a chest that hadn't known a soft emotion in decades. "Mr. Charles," the voice rang out, cutting through the humid morning air like a guillotine blade. "You are currently at 4 hours and 12 minutes. The permit for that vehicle expired at noon." I stood on the ramp of the moving truck, the heavy oak desk digging into my collarbone, and looked down at the woman who had given me up 30 years ago. Sarah Lee looked exactly like her photograph, only sharper, colder, and filtered through a layer of suburban spite. Her silver hair was pinned back so tightly it seemed to pull the skin of her forehead smooth, and her eyes, my eyes, were fixed on a silver wristwatch with the intensity of a bomb technician. I gripped the edge of the desk, the wood grain familiar under my calloused fingers. Sarah didn't recognize it, but I did. I had spent 3 months tracking this piece of furniture after finding it listed in her father's estate auction. She had sold off her own father's history like surplus inventory, a final act of tidying up a man who had died, calling for a grandson he was never allowed to meet. To her, it was just an oversized hunk of timber. To me, it was the only piece of my heritage I could actually touch. "I'm almost done, Sarah," I grunted, shifting the weight. "Give me 10 minutes. "The bylaws do not account for 10 minutes, Tony. They account for order." She clicked a heavy ballpoint pen, a sound that felt like a hammer cocking. "Bylaw 4.2. Unauthorized commercial vehicles on residential thoroughfares past permitted hours. That's a $100 fine." She began to write, her hand moving with a practiced, predatory grace. She didn't look at my face. She didn't look at the sweat soaking through my shirt or the desk she had likely sat at as a child to do her homework. To her, I wasn't a human being, let alone a son. I was a variable. I was a disruption in the visual flow of Oak Knott Lane. I watched her tuck the yellow carbon copy under the windshield wiper of my rental truck. She did it with the same clinical detachment a coroner might use to tag a toe. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Charles," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that didn't reach her eyes. "I suggest you move the truck. The next citation is doubled." As she turned on her heel, her sensible heels clicking a rhythmic, lonely cadence against the pristine asphalt, I realized my mistake. I had come here to find a mother, thinking that bringing a piece of her past back to her street might stir something behind those flinty eyes. But as I watched the iron gavel march back to her fortress at 3726, I didn't see a woman waiting to be found. I saw a woman who had spent 30 years building a cage out of rules and regulations to keep people like me out. I looked at the yellow slip fluttering in the wind and then down at the oak desk. This wasn't going to be a homecoming. This was going to be a war. And as the humidity began to rise, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't leaving until I found out exactly what or who it took to make Sarah Lee break. Today's story is from Tony Charles, a man whose life has been defined by the silent spaces between data points and the relentless pursuit of an invisible truth. As a senior data analyst, Tony spent his days untangling complex patterns for others, yet his own history remained a stubborn, unmapped territory that no spreadsheet could resolve. Raised by adoptive parents who gave him a stable life but a face he didn't recognize in the mirror, he grew into a man who values precision over sentiment and evidence over hope. He didn't come to Oak Knott Lane for a Hallmark reunion or a tearful apology. He came because his analytical mind couldn't let a mystery go unsolved. Tony does what he does because he needs to know if the woman who shared his DNA is a monster of circumstance or a master of her own cold design, and he is willing to risk his own peace to finally balance the ledger of his life. Before we dive in, if you like stories like this, smash that like button now. Comment below on where you're listening from and what you would have done if you were in Tony's situation. Would you have told Sarah who you were from the get-go? Would you have even bothered to try and find out the person she was before you decided whether you would reveal yourself to her? Today's story is not your usual tale about authority fighting the little guy, but more a story of a man trying to understand where he comes from, who he is, and who his mother is. It's heartfelt, poignant, and I hope you enjoy today's slightly different tale. Now, let's hear Tony's story as told in his own words. The manila folder sitting on my coffee table felt heavier than the 3 years of legal research contained within its edges. I sat on the floor of my half-packed apartment, the echoes of my old life bouncing off bare walls. For 30 years, the space under mother on my birth certificate had been a ghostly white void. Now, It was occupied by a name that felt far too ordinary for the gravity it held. Sarah Lee. Growing up, I was the king of the invented history. My adoptive parents, God bless them, were wonderful, but they were older when they took me in. There were soft edges and quiet afternoons in a house that smelled like cinnamon and old paper. My father, a retired librarian, and my mother, a textile artist, gave me everything except a mirror that reflected my own features. When kids at school asked why I didn't look like them, I made up stories. I told them my mother was a French spy, or a world-renowned opera singer, or an explorer lost in the Amazon. I needed her to be legendary to justify her absence. But as I hit my 20s, the legends faded, replaced by a nagging, quiet need for the mundane truth. I didn't need a spy. I just needed to know whose nose I had. Finding her hadn't been the cinematic moment I'd rehearsed. There were no tearful private investigators or dramatic reveals. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through digital archives, public property records, and census data. I had spent my career as a data analyst, a job that required staring at spreadsheets until the patterns emerged. I applied that same clinical detachment to my own life. When I finally matched the social security number from my sealed adoption records, a feat of semi-legal digital gymnastics, to a current address, the result felt like a physical blow to the chest. 3726, Oak Knott Lane. I pulled up the neighborhood's website. It was surprisingly sophisticated for a suburban development, dripping with high-resolution photos of manicured lawns and community standards. There she was, front and center on the board of directors page. Sarah Lee, president of the Oak Knott Homeowners Association. In the professional headshot, she looked formidable. Her silver hair was styled in a bob so sharp it could draw blood, and her pearls were a defensive perimeter around her neck. She wasn't smiling. She was looking at the camera with the kind of assessing gaze a jeweler might use on a flawed diamond. I looked at the image again, tracing the line of her jaw. It was my jaw. The realization sent a cold shiver through me. I had spent 30 years wondering if I looked like anyone on this planet, and the answer was a woman who looked like she'd never told a joke in her life. The more I dug into the neighborhood forums, the more the picture darkened. I found a thread titled "The Iron Gavel Strikes Again," where residents traded horror stories like war veterans. One neighbor described being fined because their holiday lights were 3 lumens too bright. Another recounted how Sarah had stood on their lawn with a ruler, measuring the height of their grass during a heat wave. They called her cold. They called her heartless. They called her a suburban dictator. My best friend Marcus told me I was insane when I showed him the listing for the small, slightly overgrown house 3 doors down from her. He'd leaned against my kitchen counter nursing a beer. "Tony, man, this is a horror movie setup. You're moving from a luxury condo in the city to a place where you have to ask permission to paint your own front door? And you're doing it. What? In disguise?" "It's not a disguise," I'd argued, packing a crate of records. "I'm using my father's name, Tony Charles. It's technically the truth. I just want to see her in the wild. I want to know who she is when she's not being a mother. I want to see if there's anything in her worth knowing before I decide to let her know I exist." I didn't tell Marcus the real fear, that if I showed up as her son, she would perform the role of a mother out of guilt. I'd spent my life around people who were kind because they loved me. I wanted to see how Sarah Lee treated people she had no reason to love. I wanted to know if her hardness was a shield she'd built after losing a child, or if she was simply a woman who loved power more than people. I took a final look at my apartment. My life here was comfortable, predictable, and safe. Oak Knott Lane represented a chaotic gamble, a leap into a world of beige siding and rigid rules. I reached out and tapped the photo on the screen, my finger resting right over her unblinking, flint-colored eyes. "Nice to meet you, Sarah," I whispered to the empty room. I closed the laptop and taped the final box shut. I had signed the closing papers that morning using a cashier's check that represented 5 years of careful saving. In 48 hours, I would be her neighbor. I would be her constituent. And if the rumors were true, I was about to become her newest target. I wasn't looking for a homecoming. I was looking for the truth, even if the truth turned out to be as cold as the silver pearls around her neck. The rental truck groaned as I pulled it onto the pristine asphalt of Oak Knott Lane. It felt like driving a tank through a porcelain museum. Everything here was quiet, unnervingly quiet. No kids were shouting, no dogs were barking, and the wind seemed to whisper through the perfectly spaced maple trees, in a way that felt rehearsed. I checked the house numbers: 3720, 3722, 3724. Then I saw it: 3726. It was a fortress of beige siding and white trim. The lawn was a mathematical achievement, every blade of grass leaning in the same direction. There were no weeds, no stray leaves, and certainly no aggressive orange welcome mats. A single, high-end sedan sat in the driveway, parked perfectly parallel to the garage door. My heart hammered against my ribs. She was in there. I kept driving, pulling into the driveway of 3732. My new home was the neighborhood's problem child. The previous owner had let the hedges grow wild, and a patch of brown was starting to claim the center of the lawn. It was the perfect blind from which to watch her. "Right," I muttered, hopping out of the cab. "Keep it professional, Tony. You're just a guy with too many boxes." I lowered the ramp with a deafening metallic clang that seemed to echo for miles. I started with the heavy stuff, hauling my oak desk toward the front door. The humidity was thick, and by the third trip, my shirt was stuck to my back. I was midway through carrying a stack of plastic bins when the atmosphere changed. The silence didn't break. It sharpened. I felt a gaze on the back of my neck before I heard the footsteps. They were rhythmic, clicking against the pavement with the precision of a metronome. I set the bins down and turned, wiping sweat from my eyes. Sarah Lee was standing at the edge of my driveway. In person, she was even more imposing than her headshot. She wore a crisp linen suit that looked immune to the heat. Her silver bob was immaculate, and she held a leather-bound clipboard against her chest like a shield. She didn't look at my face. She looked at the truck. Then she looked at her watch. "Good afternoon," I said, forcedly cheerful. "I'm Tony. I just moved in from—" "The association guidelines for moving day are quite specific, Mr. Charles," she interrupted. Her voice was like dry parchment. I froze. She knew my name. Of course she did. She had probably reviewed my closing documents the moment they hit the desk. "Oh, right," I said, trying to find a flicker of warmth in her eyes. There was nothing, just cold, gray flint. "I'm just finishing up. It's been a long day." "The moving truck was permitted for a 4-hour window, beginning at 8 a.m., she said, her eyes returning to her watch. "It is currently 12:12 p.m. You are 12 minutes over the allotted time." I blinked. 12 minutes? I'm literally on my last load. 12 minutes is the difference between order and a precedent for chaos, Sarah replied. She clicked her pen, a sharp, aggressive sound, and began writing on a yellow form. "This is a formal notice of violation. A fine of $100 will be mailed to your billing address." She stepped forward and tucked the slip under the windshield wiper of the rental truck. She did it with the practiced grace of a woman who had performed this ritual 1,000 times. "You also have a significant amount of cardboard debris accumulating on the curb," she added, finally looking me in the eye. "Cardboard must be broken down and placed inside the bins. If it is still visible by sunset, that will be an additional citation." I looked at her, really looked at her. I searched for the woman who might have held me for a few minutes before signing the papers. I looked for a hint of softness, a sign that her rigid exterior was just a mask. But as she stood there, silhouetted against her perfect house, all I saw was a woman who was disappointed by my very existence because I had made her neighborhood 12 minutes less perfect. "Is that it?" I asked, my voice lower now. "No welcome to the street? No, can I help you with that desk?" Sarah Lee adjusted her glasses. "I am the president of this association, Mr. Charles. My job is not to be your friend. My job is to ensure that your presence here does not detract from the value of your neighbor's investments." She turned on her heel and began the walk back to 3726. She didn't look back. I stood in the sweltering heat, holding a yellow piece of paper that cost me $100, and watched my mother walk away for the second time in my life. The legends I'd built in my head, the spy, the singer, the explorer, crumbled into the dusty driveway. I wasn't dealing with a legend. I was dealing with a woman who measured life in minutes and fines. "Welcome home, Tony," I whispered, the yellow slip fluttering in my hand. The $100 fine sat on my kitchen counter like a taunt. I spent my first night in the house sleeping on a mattress on the floor, listening to the hum of a neighborhood that felt more like a pressurized chamber than a home. I woke up at 6 a.m., not because I wanted to, but because I heard the distant, synchronized thwack of three different morning newspapers hitting three different driveways at the exact same moment. I decided that the direct approach had failed because I hadn't shown her I was one of them. If Sarah Lee valued order and aesthetics, I would give her a masterpiece. I spent my Saturday morning at a local nursery. I had done my homework, digging through the HOA's digital archive of approved flora and fauna. Page 14, Section B, Perennials. Sarah apparently had a soft spot for a very specific strain of deep purple petunias. They were traditional, tidy, and utterly predictable. I bought 6 flats of them, along with 3 bags of premium dark cedar mulch. By 10 a.m., I was on my hands and knees in the front garden bed of 3732 Oak Knott Lane. The sun was starting to bake the pavement, but I didn't care. I was precise. I used a level to make sure the soil was even. I spaced each flower exactly 8 inches apart, just as the manual suggested. I was smoothing out the final layer of mulch when I heard the clicking of heels. My heart did a nervous little skip. It was 10:30 a.m., the time the neighborhood forum said she began her Saturday perimeter walk. I didn't look up immediately. I waited until the shadow fell over my work. "Good morning, Sarah," I said, leaning back on my heels and wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of a gloved hand. I offered the smile I'd practiced in the mirror, warm, unassuming, and hopeful. Sarah was dressed in a crisp navy polo and white trousers that looked like they had never touched a speck of dust. She looked down at the petunias. Her eyes scanned the row, moving like a laser over each purple bloom. "Petunia ex hybrida," she said, her voice cool. "The royal velvet variety. I saw them in the manual," I said, standing up to meet her gaze. "I thought they'd add some nice curb appeal. I'm trying to get the place up to your standards." For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her expression. Not warmth exactly, but a momentary lapse in the iron discipline. Maybe she recognized the effort. Maybe she recognized the eyes. Then she leaned over and pointed a manicured finger at the edge of the flower bed. "The mulch is spread too thin near the sidewalk, Mr. Charles," she said, her voice regaining its habitual sharpness. Bylaw 8.4 requires a minimum depth of 3 inches to prevent soil erosion and unsightly runoff during heavy rains. You've barely managed 2. The smile faltered on my face. "I can add more. It's an easy fix." "Precision is never easy, Mr. Charles. It is a requirement," she snapped. She made a notation on her clipboard. "And I noticed you used cedar mulch. The approved color for this block is dark walnut. Cedar has a reddish tint that clashes with the neighboring property's brickwork." "It's dark brown, Sarah," I said, my voice rising just a fraction. "It's literally called deep forest brown on the bag." "In the shade, perhaps," she replied, looking at me as if I were a particularly stubborn weed. "But under the midday sun, the undertones are unacceptable. You have 48 hours to replace it with the walnut blend, or a second citation will be issued." She didn't ask how I was settling in. She didn't ask where I'd moved from. She didn't even acknowledge that I was trying to please her. I was just a source of clashing undertones. "Why are you doing this?" The words slipped out before I could stop them. Sarah stopped mid-step. She turned back to me, her face a mask of cold indifference. "Doing what, Mr. Charles?" "The rules. The fines. The constant watching," I said, gesturing to the empty street. "It's a beautiful morning. Most people would just say nice flowers and move on." Sarah Lee stepped closer, her shadow lengthening over my feet. "Most people are content with mediocrity. They let things slide until the grass is waist high and the paint is peeling and the value of every home on this street drops by 10%. I am the only thing standing between this community and the slide into the common." "Is that all you care about? Property values?" She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a profound, hollow emptiness behind the flint. "Order is the only thing that lasts, Mr. Charles. People leave. People fail you. But the rules stay exactly where you put them." She turned and continued her walk, her heels clicking a rhythmic, lonely cadence against the asphalt. I looked down at my purple petunias. They were perfect, but in the harsh light of Oak Knott Lane, they just looked like little splashes of bruised ink against the dirt. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting a neighbor. I was fighting a woman who had replaced her heart with a handbook because she was too afraid of anything she couldn't control. The walnut blend mulch arrived on Monday. I spent my lunch break shoveling out the cedar, feeling like a fool for trying to buy her affection with gardening supplies. By the time I finished, my hands were blistered and my back was screaming. I went inside, showered, and tried to focus on my data analysis job, but the silence of the house was too loud. I needed a win. I needed one small piece of 3732 Oak Knott Lane to feel like it belonged to Tony Charles, not the association. In my moving boxes, I found it, my welcome mat. It was a bright, saturated orange, thick and bristly, with hello written in bold, friendly white letters. It had lived at the door of my city condo for years. It was warm. It was human. I stepped out onto the porch and kicked it into place. It looked like a thumb in the eye of the beige siding. It was perfect. I didn't have to wait long for the response. Tuesday morning, the mail arrived with a formal, heavy stock envelope embossed with the HOA logo. Notice of aesthetic non-compliance, Section 12, Subsection C, entryway decor. The letter informed me that my mat was visually aggressive and failed to meet the neutral earth tone requirements of the block. I had 24 hours to remove the offending textile or face a daily compounding fine. I didn't take it down. I sat on my porch steps that evening, a beer in my hand, waiting. At 6 p.m. sharp, Sarah appeared. She didn't walk the sidewalk this time. She marched straight up my driveway. She stopped 3 feet from the porch, her eyes locked on the orange mat like it was a radioactive leak. "Mr. Charles," she said, her voice tight. "I assume you received the notice." "I did, Sarah. It's a mat. It catches dirt. That's its job." "Its job is to integrate into the architectural harmony of this street," she countered. "That color is disruptive. It draws the eye away from the landscaping. It's a cry for attention." I stood up, taller than her by half a foot, but she didn't flinch. Maybe I like the attention. Maybe I like knowing which house is mine without checking the number. Rules are not suggestions, Tony. It was the first time she'd used my first name. It hit me harder than the fines. For a second, the HOA president vanished, and I was looking at a woman who sounded exhausted by the very idea of deviation. "Why is everything a battle with you?" I asked, my voice softening. "It's just a color. It doesn't hurt anyone. It doesn't lower the value of your house. It represents a crack in the foundation," she said, her eyes flashing. "First, it's an orange mat. Then it's an unpainted fence. Then it's a car on blocks in the driveway. I've seen how quickly things fall apart when people think they're the exception to the rule. Who hurt you, Sarah?" The question hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Sarah's face went bone white. The clipboard in her hand trembled, just for a fraction of a second. Before she gripped it so hard, her knuckles turned the color of her pearls. "That is a highly inappropriate and personal question," she whispered. "You are a resident of this community. Nothing more. You will remove that mat by tomorrow morning, or I will have the maintenance crew seize it as abandoned property." She turned and walked away, her gait stiffer than usual. I watched her go, and for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt a cold, sinking realization. She wasn't just a tyrant. She was a woman living in a self-imposed prison, terrified that one bright orange thread might unravel the whole tapestry of her control. I went inside and looked at the birth certificate I'd kept tucked in my desk. I wondered if I was the disruption she had been trying to tidy up 30 years ago. That night, I swapped the mat for a drab, soulless gray one. I wasn't surrendering. I was just beginning to realize that the woman I was looking for might be buried too deep under the beige to ever be found. The gray mat looked like a tombstone on my porch. I hated it, but I needed to move closer to the source. If I couldn't reach Sarah through my own front door, I'd have to find a way through hers. On Wednesday, I saw a flyer taped to the community mailbox. Beautification Committee meeting, Thursday, 7 p.m., 3726, Oak Knott Lane. I spent the next day obsessing over my data. I looked up her voting record on the board. I looked at the neighborhood's financial ledgers. She was efficient, terrifyingly so. She had turned a sprawling suburb into a finely tuned machine, but she had done it by bleeding the joy out of the residents. At 6:58 p.m., I stood on her doorstep. My heart was a frantic bird in a cage. I rang the bell. Sarah opened the door. She was wearing a different set of pearls, but the same expression of general disappointment. She looked at my navy button-down, tucked in as per the unspoken code, and stepped aside. Mr. Charles, I didn't expect to see you here. I'm a homeowner, Sarah. I want to contribute. Her living room was a monument to the neutral earth tone policy. The walls were oatmeal, the carpet was sand, and the furniture was draped in clear plastic protectors that crinkled when I sat down. It was a room designed to be looked at, never to be lived in. 3 other neighbors were there, looking like they'd rather be having root canals. Let's begin, Sarah said, sitting in an armchair that looked like a throne. Item 1, the drainage issue at the cul-de-sac. Item 2, the proposal for a community herb garden. I saw my opening. I'd like to speak to item 2, I said. A shared garden could be great for morale. We could grow basil, rosemary, maybe even some tomatoes. It would bring people together. The room went silent. One of the neighbors, a man named Bill, who looked like he'd been beaten down by years of mulch violations, winced. Sarah didn't even look at her notes. She looked directly at me. A community garden, Mr. Charles, is a logistical nightmare. It attracts rodents. It creates uneven plots. And inevitably, someone forgets to weed their section, and then the entire neighborhood looks like a vacant lot in the city. We could have a schedule, I countered. I'll manage the rotation. It's about more than vegetables, Sarah. It's about being a community instead of just a collection of houses. Sarah's lip curled. It wasn't a smile. It was a sneer of pure, distilled condescension. Amateurs often mistake clutter for charm, Mr. Charles. You want community. I want stability. A garden is a variable I cannot control. Therefore, the proposal is denied. The meeting continued like a court-martial. She shut down a request for a new playground set because the plastic was the wrong shade of forest green. She lectured Bill for 10 minutes because his wife had been seen walking their dog with a retractable leash, which was apparently a safety hazard. I watched her through the entire ordeal. She didn't have a single friend in that room. She was the most powerful person in the neighborhood, and she was utterly, profoundly alone. I tried to imagine her 30 years ago, holding a baby. Would she have looked at me with this same clinical coldness? Would she have seen a child as just another variable she couldn't control? As the meeting broke up, I lingered. I watched her methodically straighten the coasters on the coffee table. You have a lovely home, Sarah, I said, my voice quiet. She stopped, her hand hovering over a piece of crystal. For a second, she looked almost human. It is kept to the standard, she replied. Does it ever feel quiet? I asked. Too quiet? Sarah looked up, and for a fleeting moment, I saw it. A flash of ancient, jagged pain in the depths of her gray eyes. It was gone before I could be sure. Quiet as peace, Mr. Charles, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Now, please see yourself out. You have a lot of work to do on your hedges before the weekend inspection. I walked out into the cool night air, the sound of the door clicking shut behind me. I realized then that she didn't just love the rules. She used them as a wall to keep the world and her own memories at bay. Insomnia is a side effect of living in a museum. Every time a floorboard creaked in my house, I felt like I was committing a crime against the HOA. By 2 a.m. on Tuesday, I gave up on sleep and wandered into the kitchen to make tea. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the sink, looking out the window at the moonlit street. Oak Knott Lane was a ghost town of silver and gray. That's when I saw the beam of a flashlight. It was small, a sharp needle of LED white, dancing across my front lawn. My heart skipped. I leaned closer to the glass. Sarah Lee was on my property. She was dressed in a dark trench coat, moving with a strange, frantic energy. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as she stopped at my hedges. She wasn't just looking. She was leaning in, her flashlight inches from the leaves. She seemed to be counting the branches. I felt a surge of adrenaline. Part of me wanted to throw open the window and yell, "Gotcha!" But another part, the part of me that still shared her DNA, felt a wave of pity. This wasn't just about property values. This was a compulsion. She moved from the hedges to the edge of my porch. The flashlight beam swept over the gray mat I'd bought to replace the orange one. She lingered there for a long time. Then, she did something that chilled me. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small notebook, and began writing. Her hand was moving fast, her shoulders hunched against the night air. She looked less like a president and more like a woman, haunted by the possibility of a single leaf being out of place. I grabbed my own flashlight from the drawer. I stepped onto the porch and clicked it on. Sarah jumped, a small, choked gasp escaping her. She didn't drop the notebook, but she clutched it to her chest as if it were a holy relic. The light hit her face, and for the first time, she looked her age. The lines around her mouth were deep, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and fury. "Mr. Charles," she hissed, squinting against the glare. "You nearly gave me a heart attack. What are you doing on my lawn at 2 in the morning, Sarah?" I kept my voice low, but steady. "I'm conducting a nighttime lighting and security assessment," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to regain her professional veneer. "It is a standard procedure to ensure the street lamps provide adequate coverage." "You were measuring my hedges," I said, stepping down onto the grass. "And you were staring at my mat. Is this how you spend your nights? Stalking the neighbors?" "I don't stalk, Tony. I maintain." She straightened her coat, her eyes hardening. "Your hedge on the north side is 3 inches higher than the south side. It creates an asymmetrical profile that disrupts the visual flow of the cul-de-sac." "It's 2 in the morning," I repeated, incredulous. "The visual flow is currently invisible. Go home, Sarah. Get some sleep." She didn't move. She stood there, the flashlight in her hand shaking. "You think this is a joke? You think I'm just a bitter woman with a clipboard? But you have no idea how hard I've worked to keep this place safe." "Safe from what? A slightly uneven bush? Safe from the mess," she snapped, her voice cracking. "Life is messy, Tony. People are messy. They come and they go. And they leave behind nothing but broken things and empty rooms. But this is clean. This is predictable." She looked at me then, and the flashlight beam between us caught a tear as it rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just stood there, a prisoner of her own perfection. "Good night, Mr. Charles," she whispered. She turned and walked back to 3726, her flashlight beam swinging wildly as she hurried away. I stood on my lawn until her front door clicked shut. I looked back at my asymmetrical hedges. I realized then that Sarah Lee wasn't trying to fix the neighborhood. She was trying to fix a life that had gone wrong a long time ago, and I was just the latest variable she couldn't account for. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center basement, a room that smelled of industrial cleaner and suppressed resentment. I arrived early, sitting in the back row. I wanted to see her from a distance, to see if the woman who cried on my lawn at 2 a.m. still existed behind the iron gavel. She didn't. Sarah entered the room like a monarch entering a conquered territory. She wore a charcoal suit and an expression that would have frozen a furnace. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She sat at the head table, clicked her pen, and called the meeting to order with a strike of her wooden gavel that made the woman next to me jump. For the first 40 minutes, I watched her dismantle the lives of my neighbors. "Mr. and Mrs. Gable," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the cinder block walls. "You were seen unloading a plastic slide into your backyard on Saturday. Section 9 explicitly prohibits primary colored recreational structures visible from any communal vantage point." The Gables, a young couple who looked like they hadn't slept since their daughter was born, tried to argue. "It's for our 3-year-old, Sarah. It's in the backyard behind a fence." "The fence is 4 feet high. The slide is 5, Sarah snapped, not even looking up from her ledger. "The visual pollution affects the property value of the house behind you. You have 48 hours to dismantle it, or the daily fine begins at $50. Next." I felt a slow, hot simmer of anger rising in my chest. It wasn't just the rules. It was the clinical joy she took in the execution. She was efficient, cold, and utterly devoid of empathy. She treated the neighborhood like a spreadsheet where every person was a rounding error she needed to correct. When the floor opened for new business, I stood up. "Tony Charles, 3732, I said. My voice sounded steady, but my heart was thumping against my ribs. Sarah's eyes flicked to me. For a fraction of a second, I saw the memory of the flashlight beam in her pupils, but then the shutters slammed shut. "Yes, Mr. Charles, I trust this isn't another request for a vegetable patch." A few people chuckled nervously. I didn't smile. "Actually, Sarah, I wanted to propose a neighborhood mixer. A simple Saturday afternoon barbecue in the park. No agendas, no fines. Just a chance for people to meet the person living next door. The room went deathly silent. I saw Bill from the committee meeting lean forward, a spark of hope in his eyes. Sarah leaned back in her chair. She didn't speak for a long time. She just stared at me, her lip curling in a sneer that tasted like salt and old bitterness. "Mr. Charles," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level. "You have been in this community for less than a month. In that time, you have violated truck permits, mulch standards, and decorum. And now, you want to invite chaos into our communal spaces. It's a barbecue, Sarah, not a riot. In this neighborhood, they are the same thing," she snapped, standing up. She leaned over the table, her shadow looming large on the wall behind her. "We are a residential association, Mr. Charles, not a summer camp. If you wanted a social club, you should have stayed in the city. Here, we value order. We value the sanctity of the suburb. You are a disruptive element who clearly doesn't understand the responsibility of homeownership." She looked around the room, her gaze a warning to anyone who dared to agree with me. "Proposal denied for lack of merit and potential for liability. This meeting is adjourned." She struck the gavel. Crack, and the sound felt like a door slamming in my face. The room cleared out quickly. People didn't linger to chat. They scurried away, terrified that being seen with me would put a target on their backs. I stayed in my chair, watching Sarah as she methodically packed her leather briefcase. I realized then that there was no reunion coming. There was no moment where she would see me and the ice would melt. To Sarah Lee, I wasn't a son. I wasn't even a human being. I was just a line of code she couldn't quite delete from her perfect system. I stood up and walked toward the exit, but as I passed the head table, I stopped. "You won, Sarah," I said quietly. She didn't look up from her briefcase. "The rules won, Mr. Charles. I'm simply their steward." "No," I replied. "You're just their prisoner." I walked out into the night, the heavy scent of industrial cleaner still clinging to my clothes. I had come here to find a mother. All I had found was a judge who had already handed down my sentence. The humidity of the night hit me like a damp wool blanket as I stepped out of the community center. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline of the confrontation. I didn't want to go home to my sterile, gray-matted house. I lingered by my car, watching the other board members scurry away like shadows in the night. A few minutes later, the heavy metal doors creaked open again. Sarah emerged alone. In the harsh, buzzing glow of the overhead yellow street lamps, she looked different. The iron gavel facade didn't quite fit her out here in the open air. She walked toward her sedan, her leather briefcase clutched so tightly to her side that her shoulder was hiked up to her ear. She looked small. I didn't plan to talk to her. I intended to get in my car and drive, but my feet moved before my brain could veto the decision. I cut across the asphalt, my shadow stretching out long and jagged toward her. "Sarah," I called out. She jumped, nearly dropping her keys. She spun around, her eyes wide and frantic, darting across the empty lot as if looking for a witness or an escape route. When she realized it was just me, the fear curdled instantly into a familiar, cold rage. "Mr. Charles," she spat, her voice raspy. "I believe I made myself clear inside. Harassment of a board member is a Tier 1 violation. I will not hesitate to call the authorities." "I'm not harassing you," I said, stopping 10 feet away. I'm trying to understand. I've seen you on my lawn at night. I saw you just now. You're miserable, Sarah. Why do you spend every waking second making everyone else as miserable as you are?" She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she turned back to her car and began fumbling with the lock. But as she struggled with the key, I heard it. A low, rhythmic muttering. "Lowering the values," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "The weeds, the noise. They bring the noise. If the noise starts, it never stops. You have to keep it out. You have to weed out the riffraff. Keep it clean. Keep it quiet. Don't let the mess in." It wasn't a lecture. It was a litany, a prayer. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to the demons in her own head. I stood there, frozen, as I realized the true depth of her pathology. This wasn't about property values or beige siding. This was a woman who had experienced a chaos so profound, perhaps the chaos of giving up a child, or a life that had shattered in her hands. That she had spent the next 30 years building a fortress of bylaws to make sure she never felt a single uncontrolled emotion again. She finally got the door open and threw her briefcase into the passenger seat. She turned to me one last time, her face illuminated by the sickly yellow light. "You think you're different," she said, her lip curling in that habitual sneer. But this time, it was laced with a genuine, haunting spite. "You think you're the nice guy who's going to save the neighborhood with a barbecue? But you're just a disruption. You're the mess. And I've spent my whole life cleaning up messes like you." She climbed in and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, a perfect, muffled purr, and she sped out of the lot without looking back. I stood in the silence of the empty parking lot for a long time. The epiphany didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like a door locking. I had come here looking for a mother who might have a hole in her heart where I used to be. But Sarah Lee didn't have a hole. She had filled that space with concrete and covered it in walnut blend mulch. Telling her the truth wouldn't bring her peace. It would just be another violation for her to cite. She didn't want a son. She didn't even want a neighbor. She wanted a vacuum. I realized then that the woman I had been searching for didn't exist. She had died a long time ago, buried under a mountain of yellow carbon copies and neutral earth tone paint chips. "I'm done," I whispered to the empty air. I walked to my car, got in, and drove home. But as I pulled into my driveway and looked at the dark house at 3726, I didn't feel the urge to watch her anymore. I just felt a profound, exhausting pity. The silence of 3732, Oak Knott Lane, was a heavy, suffocating thing. I sat on the floor of my dark living room, the only illumination coming from the pale, sickly glow of the street lamp outside filtering through the blinds. I deliberately kept the lights off. I didn't want to give Sarah anything to look at. No movement to track, no unauthorized nocturnal activity to log in that leather-bound notebook of hers. I pulled a small wooden box from my desk, the one I'd carried through 3 apartments and a decade of wondering. Inside were the few relics of my beginning: a hospital bracelet with a blurred ink stamp, a single grainy Polaroid of a woman's hands holding a bundle of blankets, and the birth certificate that had led me to this street. I laid them out on the hardwood floor like pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a picture. I tried to map her face onto the woman I'd seen in the parking lot. I tried to find a trace of the woman who had once been young and terrified in the hard, angular lines of the HOA president. I looked for the ghost of a smile, a softness in the eyes, a hint of the woman who had given me life. Equals. It didn't fit. The mother I had imagined for 30 years, the one who lived in the French Spy or opera singer stories of my youth, was a woman who had made a heartbreaking choice so that her son could have a better life. In my mind, she was a tragic figure, a woman who surely must have spent at least one night a year staring at the moon and wondering where I was, what my voice sounded like, and if I had turned out okay. But as I stared at the dark, silent house at 3726 Oak Knott Lane, the truth settled in my gut like lead. Sarah Lee hadn't made a choice for me. She had made a choice for herself. She didn't want a life of variables. She didn't want a person who required love, mistakes, noise, and the unpredictable chaos of childhood. She wanted the sanctity of the suburb. She wanted a world where every problem could be solved with a $50 fine and a ruler. I realized that being her son was a biological fact, a piece of data on a piece of paper that didn't mean anything in the real world. But being her target was a choice I was making every single day I stayed in this house. I was waiting for a ghost to wake up, but the ghost was the only thing left of her. The woman sitting 3 doors down was a stranger who lived to exert control because she had nothing else to hold on to. She wasn't holding back a flood of maternal love. She was holding back a flood of resentment for anyone who dared to be human in her presence. I picked up the Polaroid of her hands. They were smooth then, younger, but even through the grain of the old film, I could see it. The same tight, possessive grip she used on her clipboard today. Even then, she was holding on for dear life, terrified of the mess. Maybe I was the first mess she ever had to clean up. Maybe the act of giving me away wasn't a sacrifice, but the first act of maintenance she ever performed. The realization didn't make me angry anymore. It just made me tired. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need her to recognize my eyes or tell me she was sorry. I didn't even want her to know who I was. If I told her the truth now, it wouldn't be a reunion. it would be a weapon. It would be a way to hurt her for being cold, a way to force a crack in her armor by using her own guilt against her. And as much as I was hurting, I didn't want to be like her. I didn't want to use the truth as a tool for control. I put the photos and the bracelet back in the box and snapped the lid shut. The sound was small, but it felt like a finality. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since the day I moved in, the desperate, childlike need to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be loved by the woman who had cast me off, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet, steady clarity that felt like waking up from a long, feverish dream. I was more than a disruptive element. I was a person who deserved a home where the grass height mattered less than the people living behind the door. I deserved a life that wasn't measured in neutral earth tones and aesthetic noncompliance. I pulled out my phone, the screen's light blinding in the dark room. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the real estate agent who had helped me buy this place. It was nearly midnight, but I didn't care. I sent the text, the blue bubble of the message feeling like a flare sent up from a sinking ship. Hey, it's Tony Charles. I need to list 3,732 as soon as possible. I'm moving back to the city. Price it to move fast. I want to be gone by the end of the month. I set the phone down on the floor and looked out the window. For the first time since I arrived, the silence of Oak Knott Lane didn't feel like a threat. It just felt empty. I was done chasing a woman who had replaced her heart with a handbook. I was ready to go back to a world that was messy, loud, and real. I looked at Sarah's house one last time and realized that the iron gavel wasn't a symbol of power. It was the only thing keeping her house from feeling as empty as it truly was. The sun hadn't even cleared the gables of the houses across the street when I started. I didn't care about the no external noise before 8 a.m. rule anymore. I dragged the first stack of flattened cardboard boxes onto the porch and began the rhythmic, aggressive sound of taping them shut. Rip, scrape, snap. It was a violent, industrial symphony that shattered the curated peace of the cul-de-sac. I wanted the sound to carry across the 3 lawns between us. I wanted her to hear the sound of a closure she couldn't control. By 9 a.m., the living room was a graveyard of half-formed hopes. I packed the data reports from my job, the kitchen appliances I'd barely used, and the approved neutral gray mat that had felt like a surrender every time I stepped on it. I realized as I worked that I wasn't just packing belongings. I was packing away the 30-year-old fantasy of the woman I thought Sarah Lee might be. Every strip of tape I smoothed down felt like a seal on a tomb. I was halfway through the kitchen, wrapping plates in old newspaper, when the doorbell rang. I didn't have to look through the peephole. I knew the cadence of that ring. Short, sharp, and demanding, like a summons to a principal's office. I opened the door to find Sarah Lee standing on my porch. She wasn't alone. She had a man with her, a younger guy in a maintenance uniform carrying a digital camera and a tablet. Sarah looked at the boxes visible in the hallway behind me, and for the first time, her composure seemed to fray at the edges. Her gaze darted from a stack of crates to a loose roll of bubble wrap, as if she were witnessing a crime scene. "Mr. Charles," she said, her voice tight and high. "I see you are engaged in significant logistical activity. Activity for which no permit has been filed." "I'm moving, Sarah. Listing the house today. I don't think I need a permit to pack my own socks." The man with the camera stepped forward to take a photo of a stray piece of packing tape that had stuck to my porch railing, but I stepped in his way, blocking his lens. "Not today, buddy. I'm off the clock, and so are you. Get off my property." Sarah ignored the tension. Her eyes were still scanning my hallway, searching for a hidden violation within the skeleton of my private life. The association requires a 30-day notice for a change in residency status. There is also the matter of the departure inspection. Any damage to the curb, the sidewalk, or the common area turf during the removal of heavy furniture will be billed directly to your escrow. "Send me the bill," I said, leaning casually against the doorframe. I didn't feel the need to stand up straight or pull my shoulders back for her anymore. The iron gavel held no weight here. "But you can stop the inspections. I'm done playing the game, Sarah. You win. The neighborhood is safe from my orange mats." "This isn't a game, Tony," she said, and for the first time, I heard a strange, frantic note beneath the ice. "There are procedures. There is a way things are done to maintain the integrity of the street. You can't just leave. Not like this. Not in the middle of the month." "Why not?" "I don't fit the visual flow, remember? I'm a disruptive element. You told the whole neighborhood I was a threat to the sanctity of the suburb." You should be throwing a parade now that the riffraff is taking his trash and going home. She reached out, her hand hovering near my sleeve, a maternal gesture she didn't seem to know how to finish, before she caught herself and gripped her clipboard so hard her knuckles turned a ghostly white. The market is delicate. A for sale sign on this block, so soon after a purchase, suggests instability. It suggests the neighborhood is undesirable. It reflects poorly on my leadership. I looked at her, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. It wasn't about the property values, and it wasn't about the rules. It was about the fact that I was a variable she hadn't finished solving. I was a person who had looked at her, seen the cracks in the porcelain, and was now walking away before she could fix me into a shape she recognized. My departure was a mess she couldn't tidy up with $100 fine. I'm moving back to the city, Sarah. Back to the noise, the weeds, and the people who don't measure their grass. You can have your silence back. You can have the whole street to yourself. You can be the queen of an empty kingdom. You're being reckless, she whispered, her eyes fixed on a box labeled beadroom. You had so much potential to be a proper resident. If you would just follow the framework, you could have been happy here. I'm not a resident, I interrupted, my voice dropping to a quiet, final tone. And I'm not one of your projects. I'm just a guy who realized that living in a museum is the same as being dead. I'd rather be messy and alive than perfect and hollow like this place. I started to close the door, but she stood her ground for a second longer, looking at me with an expression that wasn't anger or even disappointment. It was a terrifying, hollow loneliness. I saw the woman who lived at 3726, the woman who had traded every human connection, including the son she had discarded 30 years ago, for a world where nothing ever changed and nothing ever hurt. The sign, she said, her voice regaining its iron chill as she stepped back onto the sidewalk. Make sure it's the approved size. If it's even an inch over the regulation height, I will have the maintenance crew remove it as a nuisance. I'll bring my ruler, I said, and I didn't hide the pity in my voice. I shut the door and turned the lock. The heavy thud of the bolt echoed through the empty house. I leaned my head against the cool wood, listening to the rhythmic, lonely click of her heels retreating down my driveway. I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my chest. I wasn't running away. I was finally, for the first time in my life, choosing a reality that didn't involve begging for the crumbs of a stranger's affection. I picked up a thick black marker and wrote "Kitchen Fragile" on a box in big, bold, messy letters that bled over the edges. It felt like the most honest thing I'd done since I set foot on Oak Knott Lane. The real estate agent, a woman named Diane, who looked like she'd survived a few HOA wars of her own, arrived at noon. She didn't bother with small talk. She just handed me the approved residential advertisement sign. It was a dull, depressing beige with black lettering. No sold banners, no bright accents, no personality. It looked like a tombstone for a house that hadn't even died yet. She's watching us, isn't she? Diane asked, nodding toward 3726. I didn't have to look. I could feel the weight of the binoculars from the upstairs window of the fortress. She's probably got a stopwatch and a tape measure ready. I took the sign and walked to the edge of the lawn. The grass was slightly overgrown. I'd stopped mowing 3 days ago as a quiet act of sedition, and the earth felt stubborn. I shoved the metal spikes into the dirt. I didn't use a level. I didn't check the distance from the curb. I just jammed it in until it stayed. It was in the ground for less than an hour before Sarah appeared. She didn't march this time. She drifted down the sidewalk like a haunt. She was dressed in a pale gray suit that made her blend into the overcast sky. In her hand, she wasn't holding a clipboard. She was holding a wooden yardstick. I walked out to the edge of the driveway, crossing my arms. Afternoon, Sarah. I see you brought the heavy artillery. She didn't acknowledge the joke. She knelt on the grass, her movements stiff and pained, and pressed the yardstick against the side of the sign. She squinted at the measurements, her lips moving in a silent, frantic count. 25 inches, she whispered, her voice cracking. The limit for a temporary residential advertisement is 24. This is a Tier 2 violation of Section 15. I looked down at her. From this angle, I could see the thinning hair at the crown of her head and the way her hands trembled as she held the wood. She looked fragile. For weeks, I had seen her as a monster, an obstacle, a judge. But standing over her now, I realized she was just a broken machine, trying to calibrate a world that had moved past her decades ago. Does it really matter, Sarah? I asked. My voice wasn't angry anymore. It was just tired. An inch? I'm leaving. In 48 hours, I'll be a name on a closing statement and a memory you can delete. Why does an inch of metal and plastic matter so much to you? She snapped the yardstick back and stood up, breathing hard. It matters because if I let you have an inch, the next person takes a foot, and then the fences come down, and then the colors change. And then everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed to keep this place pure, it all turns back into the mess. The mess is where the people are, Sarah, I said. I stepped closer until I was just a foot away. You think you're protecting this place, but you're just embalming it. You're sitting in a beautiful, perfect coffin, waiting for someone to notice how clean the lid is, her eyes filled with a sudden, sharp moisture. You don't know anything about me. I know more than you think, I said. I reached into my pocket and felt the corner of the adoption paper. For a split second, I wanted to pull it out. I wanted to say, I am the mess you couldn't clean up. I am the variable you tried to delete. But I looked at her, really looked at the hollow, terrified woman behind the iron gavel, and I realized that the truth would be a cruelty she couldn't survive. She had built this wall of rules to keep the pain of my absence or the shame of her choice from ever reaching her. To break it down now wouldn't be a reunion, it would be a demolition. You're right, I said, pulling my hand out of my pocket, empty. I don't know you, and after Friday, I never will. Sarah stood there, her yardstick clutched like a weapon, as I turned and walked back into my house. I didn't look back to see if she pulled the sign out. I didn't check to see if she was writing a ticket. Inside, I sat on a packing crate and watched the clock. The house was an echo chamber of my own footsteps. I felt a strange sense of mourning, not for the mother I had found, but for the mother I had finally, permanently let go of. She had won her little war. She had kept her street perfect. And as I looked at the bare walls, I realized that was the most devastating punishment she could ever receive. The morning of the move was gray and windless, the sky a flat sheet of pewter that matched the approved neutral palette of the street. The moving truck, a massive white beast that Sarah surely loathed for its visual volume, sat idling at the curb. Its diesel engine produced a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of 3,732. A final, loud heartbeat in a neighborhood that preferred to hold its breath. I did one last sweep of the house. The echoes of my boots on the hardwood were the only things left in the rooms. No furniture, no boxes, no orange mats, and no purple petunias. Just empty space and the faint, lingering scent of packing tape and floor wax. I stood in the center of the living room where I had sat in the dark just nights before, and I realized I didn't feel a shred of regret. This house hadn't been a home. It had been an experiment, a laboratory where I'd tested the limits of a stranger's capacity for grace and found them wanting. I walked out to the driveway, the heavy front door clicking shut behind me with a finality that resonated in my teeth. I felt the keys in my pocket, heavy, cold, and temporary. I walked over to the communal mailbox at the end of the cul-de-sac and slipped them into the real estate agent's lockbox. My hands didn't shake. The metal-on-metal sound of the latch was the last transaction I would ever have with this place. I turned to look at 3726. Sarah was standing on her porch. She wasn't holding a clipboard this time. She wasn't measuring the height of her hedges or checking the alignment of her neighbor's shutters. She was just standing there, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching me with the same unblinking, flint-colored intensity she'd used on the first day I arrived. She looked like a statue carved from the same beige stone as her house, monumental, cold, and entirely alone. I walked to the cab of the truck and climbed in, the vinyl seat cracking under my weight. The driver looked at me, his hand on the gear shift, waiting for the signal to breach the peace of the suburb one last time. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, real, unfiltered air that didn't smell like lemon polish or walnut blend mulch. "Ready to go, boss?" he asked, glancing at the for sale sign I'd left standing crookedly in the grass. "Ready?" I said. As we pulled away, the truck's air brakes hissed like a long, tired sigh. I looked in the massive side mirror, watching my house grow smaller. I saw the approved beige sign becoming a tiny, insignificant speck against the lawn I'd intentionally left unmowed. Then, I saw Sarah move. She didn't wave a hand in farewell, and she didn't run after the truck with a final citation. Instead, she stepped down from her porch and walked slowly, methodically, toward my property line. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to check the curb for tire marks. She was going to see if the moving crew had trampled a single blade of grass or left a stray piece of bubble wrap in the gutter. She was already beginning the process of erasing me, of smoothing over the disruption I had caused, so that her kingdom could be silent and sterile once again. She was tidying up the memory of me before the truck had even reached the end of the block. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the small wooden box. I took the birth certificate, the one that had brought me through 3 decades of wandering and 3 weeks of war, and I tore it into 4 neat pieces. I didn't do it out of anger or spite. I did it because I didn't need the data anymore. The paper said she was my mother, but the life I'd lived on Oak Knott Lane proved she was just a woman who had chosen a handbook over a heartbeat. The biological link was a fact, but the relationship was a fiction I was finally done writing. I rolled down the window, letting the wind whip into the cab. It smelled of damp earth, rain, and freedom. I let the pieces of paper go. They danced in the wake of the truck for a second, white butterflies against the dark asphalt, before they were scattered into the hedges and swallowed by the distance. I looked at the rearview mirror one last time. Sarah was a tiny gray dot now, hunched over the edge of the sidewalk, likely documenting a scuff mark I'd left on the concrete. She had won her little war. She had her order. She had her rules. She had her perfect, unblemished street. And as the truck turned the corner and the gates of Oak Knott Lane disappeared behind us, I realized the truth I'd really come here to find. She hadn't driven me out. I had simply outgrown the cage she'd spent her whole life building for herself. I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the city skyline begin to rise on the horizon, a jagged, messy, beautiful sprawl of light and noise. For the first time in 30 years, I wasn't looking for a ghost. I was just Tony Charles. And as the truck accelerated onto the highway, I realized that was the only thing I'd ever really needed to be. And that's Tony's story. Once again, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. It's the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. And I hope you enjoyed today's change of pace. But now, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think happened between Tony and his mom? Comment below your thoughts, and I hope to see you in the next one.